My brother inherited everything. Then I found the letter that changed the entire will. I never imagined my life would spin into such a mess that I'd be standing in a cramped notary's office, my heart pounding like a jackhammer, listening to the one thing I thought would never happen. My brother Josh inheriting everything. I'm talking the entire family home, the business, the stocks, the cash. Every last shred of what my late father Thomas Parker spent decades building. Meanwhile, I was left with a single musty cabin on a remote lake and a polite apology in legal form. I remember feeling this sharp, twisting sensation in my gut as the notary, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and read aloud from the official documents. Josh, leaning back in his chair with an expression so smug it made my blood boil, just nodded along like he'd expected this all his life. My father had died only a few weeks earlier, and I was still wrestling with my grief. The last thing I needed was another punch to the gut. But that's exactly what I got. Instead of splitting things evenly, the way Dad always promised he would, the will apparently stated that every meaningful asset should pass to Josh. It didn't make sense. It felt like a betrayal. I'd always believed Dad was at least somewhat fair, even if he and I never really saw eye to eye. I tried not to cry in front of everyone, but my eyes burned and my cheeks felt hot. I just stood there, stunned into silence until Josh gave me this sympathetic pat on the shoulder that somehow made it worse. It was in that moment, while the notary was still droning on, while the stale air in the office felt unbearably heavy, while I noticed the faint smell of old carpet, that something inside me shifted. I couldn't accept it. There had to be a mistake. Dad had told me, in his final weeks, that he intended to do right by both of us. Sure, we'd had our conflicts, but he'd promised me. And the father I remembered, especially in his last days, wasn't the kind of man who would shut out his younger son for the sake of tradition or favoritism. Dad wasn't perfect, but he wasn't cruel. So what was going on? I left that office feeling like the walls were closing in on me. My head buzzed with questions. Why would Dad have changed his mind so drastically? Or had someone tampered with his will? The ride home was a blur of stoplights and honking horns. I parked in front of my small apartment building, not even sure how I got there safely. My phone kept buzzing with messages, some from distant relatives, some from old family friends. One of them was from Aunt Linda, who texted, "So sorry, Brandon. You deserved more." Another was from my cousin Mitch, who asked if the rumors were true that Josh had suddenly inherited practically everything. I didn't want to talk to anyone, so I silenced my phone and just sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. That's when I remembered one of the last conversations I'd had with Dad. I'd been visiting him at the hospital. He was exhausted, pale, but he managed to smile when I walked in. "Brandon," he whispered, "it's been a tough road for me. I know I've made mistakes, but I'll fix them. I promise you that." I didn't press for details because I figured he meant personal regrets. Maybe some big fatherly apology. But now, replaying his words in my head, I realized he must have been talking about his will, about making sure I didn't get overlooked. That memory collided painfully with the reality of me being left with nothing but a run-down cabin I hadn't even known existed until the notary read it out. It was too bizarre. For a while, I sank into a restless depression. I went through the motions of daily life, but all my thoughts revolved around this sinking feeling that I'd been cheated, that my father's true intention was buried under something sinister. One afternoon, after ignoring the rest of my family's attempts to contact me, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It turned out to be an old family friend, Henry Gardner, who used to serve as Dad's accountant. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to pick up. Henry's voice was tinged with hesitation. "Brandon," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for your loss. Look, I can't talk long, but I just need to ask, are you absolutely sure your dad's will was read in its entirety? Because he and I discussed some changes right before he passed away. He even asked me for references to another attorney. This was only a couple of months ago." My breath caught. "He never mentioned that to me," I said. "But it wouldn't surprise me if he planned revisions." Henry paused, then added, "I can't say for certain, but your dad was adamant about sorting out the estate fairly. That's all. Do what you must with that information. And be careful, okay?" He hung up before I could ask more questions. Be careful? Why did Henry feel the need to warn me? My mind started spinning scenarios. Maybe Dad had changed the will, but it was never processed. Or someone intercepted it. Or maybe there was a second document or an addendum that no one knew about except Henry. Whatever the case, I couldn't sit idle anymore. I decided to go searching for clues in the one place that might hold them. Dad's old study. The problem: that study was inside the family home. The very place Josh now legally owned. Accessing it meant dealing with him, which I wanted to avoid. I weighed my options for a couple of days, then realized I had to bite the bullet. I drove out to the old Parker residence early on a Saturday morning, half expecting to be turned away at the door. A wave of nostalgia hit me as soon as I saw the front porch. I remembered climbing those steps as a little kid, looking forward to Dad coming home from business trips. Now the place felt cold, foreign. The once immaculate lawn was slightly overgrown. I rang the bell, and after a few moments, Josh answered. He looked genuinely startled to see me. "Brandon," he said, crossing his arms. "Didn't think you'd be coming around." His tone was guarded. I tried to stay calm and act casual. "I want to grab a few of Dad's personal items," I lied. "Stuff I left in his study." Josh narrowed his eyes. "I haven't touched anything in there yet. Go ahead, but don't take anything that's rightfully mine." I almost laughed at the sheer arrogance, but I just forced a stiff nod and slipped past him. The study had once been Dad's sanctuary. A massive oak desk dominated the room, lined with shelves full of ledgers, business books, random souvenirs from his travels. Dust swirled in the morning light. There was a faint smell of old paper and leather. I rummaged carefully through drawers, scanning for any sign of updated legal documents. Dad was pretty old-fashioned. He liked to keep physical copies of everything. Yet after a good hour, I'd found nothing but mundane bills, receipts, a couple of property deeds that matched the official will. A wave of defeat washed over me. Maybe I was chasing shadows. Then I noticed a locked file cabinet in the corner, one I didn't recognize. The metal looked new. My pulse quickened. Where would Dad have kept the key? Or did he use a combination lock? Suddenly, I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I turned to see Josh leaning against the doorframe, arms still crossed. He glanced at the locked cabinet, then back at me. "You think you're gonna find something in there?" he asked, smirking. "Listen, you can't keep turning this into a conspiracy. Dad's official will is the official will. Accept it, Brandon." My heart thundered in my chest as I tried to feign indifference. "I'm just looking for some keepsakes. Might be in there." He rolled his eyes, strode forward, and calmly tapped the file cabinet. "Suit yourself, but I don't know where the key is." Without offering any help, he left. Frustration welled up inside me as I realized I might have to break the lock if I really wanted to see inside. But doing so would cause a scene. Instead, I took pictures of the cabinet, the brand, the lock. Then I pretended to gather a few random things off Dad's bookshelf. An old dictionary, some framed photos from trips he took with me as a kid, and departed. Back at my apartment, I hit the internet, searching for ways to open that particular type of lock. People had posted various tutorials, but I wasn't exactly skilled in lockpicking. I was on the verge of giving up when I got a text from Henry Gardner again. "Any updates?" he asked. I told him about the locked cabinet. He said, "If your father bought a new lockable file cabinet, he might have left the key in an unexpected place. He was always meticulous about storing keys and passwords. Check his personal safe or desk at the office if you can." The office, that meant Dad's business headquarters, Parker Management, which Josh also controlled now. But it was a public enough location that I might have fewer problems walking in. Maybe I could rummage around Dad's old desk. Desperate times call for desperate measures, right? A few days later, I took a personal day from work and headed downtown to Parker Management. My father's name was still on the building's directory in gold letters, which felt bittersweet. The receptionist recognized me and assumed I was there on official family business. I walked up to Dad's old office, which had not yet been fully reassigned. Inside, everything was unsettlingly quiet. I looked through the drawers, careful to keep an ear out for any employees passing by. I was about ready to give up when I spotted a small locked drawer at the very bottom of the desk. The lock looked simpler than the one on the file cabinet at home. I managed to pry it open with a small screwdriver from Dad's desk set. My heart leapt as I saw a tiny manila envelope labeled keys. Inside were two small keys. One had desk cabinet etched into its metal surface. The other had no label at all. Bingo. I raced back to the house that afternoon, knowing Josh was usually at a lunch meeting. The place seemed empty. Using the same side door code I'd known since childhood, I slipped in. I hurried to the study, crouched in front of the file cabinet, and slid in the unlabeled key. It turned with a click. My heart pounded. Inside the top drawer were various folders, old bank statements, and stock certificates. Nothing that would surprise me. Then I noticed a large white envelope at the bottom marked Revised Will Draft. My entire body buzzed with adrenaline. I picked it up, opened it, and found a set of papers that looked like the framework for a new will. My father's signature wasn't on the final page, but each page had his initials. Several handwritten notes in the margins indicated he intended to finalize this soon. The biggest bombshell, the revised draft stated that the entire estate should be split evenly between Josh and me. My father explicitly wrote that he'd recognized certain imbalances in the original will and wanted to correct them so both sons got a fair share. I actually had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't dreaming. This was proof that Dad wanted me to inherit half of everything. The sense of relief and vindication was almost overwhelming. But then dread crept in. This was just a draft, not notarized, not witnessed. Would it hold up legally? Would Josh try to claim it was fake, or that Dad was coerced? I took photos of every page as a precaution, then carefully put the documents back in the folder and tucked it under my jacket. That's when I heard the front door slam. My stomach dropped. Josh was home. In a panic, I closed the cabinet, locked it, and dashed into the hallway. There he stood, setting down his briefcase. Our eyes locked. "Brandon, why are you here again?" he demanded. I forced a smile, which probably looked more like a grimace. "Just looking for some more of Dad's personal items," I lied. He stepped closer, scanning me from head to toe, possibly noticing the bulge under my jacket. "I don't recall giving you an open invitation to barge in," he said, crossing his arms. I shrugged and tried to keep my voice steady. "You said I could come by. You never said I had to make an appointment. Anyway, I'm done." Without another word, I pushed past him, my heart hammering as I wondered if he'd chase after me or try to search me. But he let me go. That night, I showed the draft will to Henry Gardner, who was equally stunned and relieved. We both knew that legally, an unsigned draft wouldn't magically nullify the official will, but it was strong evidence that Dad had, in fact, changed his mind and intended to formalize a different arrangement. Henry recommended I contact a lawyer who specialized in estate disputes, a woman named Patricia Gray. The next day, I did just that. Meeting her in her downtown office, I laid out all the facts. Dad's sudden death, the official will that gave Josh everything, my father's last words hinting at changes, the locked cabinet, the draft, and my suspicion that Josh might have known and deliberately hid this. Patricia pored over the documents with a critical eye. "You have a compelling case," she said, her tone measured. "But it's not a slam dunk. We'll need to prove your father's intent. This draft alone might not suffice. The court will ask why he didn't sign it. We'll want testimony from people like Henry, maybe others who spoke to your father, possibly an expert to confirm your father's handwriting and notes. Are you ready for a fight? Because if your brother's as entrenched as you say, he'll push back hard." I thought of Josh's smirk and felt a surge of determination. "I'm ready," I said, though I secretly dreaded a full-blown legal battle. This is what my father wanted. Patricia gave me a sympathetic nod. So began the nightmare of legal motions, challenges, depositions, and endless paperwork. When we filed a formal challenge to the will, Josh erupted in fury. He called me, left voicemails laced with accusations that I was trying to defame Dad's memory, fabricating documents, and behaving like a vulture. I saved every message. I noticed the tone of his calls changed from anger to desperation when he realized I had evidence. "Brandon," he said in one message, "think about what you're doing." Dad must have been confused. You know the official will is valid. But I remembered Dad's eyes in that hospital bed, the conviction in his voice when he said he'd fix his mistakes. It was nothing like confusion. In the midst of all this, I was swamped with memories of my childhood. Josh was older by a couple of years, always the golden boy, the one Dad put in charge whenever he traveled for work. I recalled how Dad let him run errands for the family business in high school, while I was told to, "Stick to your studies, Brandon. This business might not be for you." I'd resented that. Over time, Josh and I grew distant, especially after Dad started grooming him as the heir apparent. But Dad always said, "When the time is right, you'll have your place too." So now that place was at stake. Yet deep down, I didn't only care about the money or the company. I cared about clearing my father's name. He wasn't the kind of man who'd let his younger son drift away with no inheritance. That was Josh's narrative, not Dad's. Our legal team got stronger after Patricia brought in a handwriting specialist. This expert confirmed that all the annotations and initials on the draft matched Dad's writing. She also pointed out differences between the official will's signature and Dad's known signature style. Nothing that invalidated it outright, but enough to raise questions. Then we subpoenaed some of Dad's medical records and found that, contrary to what Josh had claimed, Dad's mental faculties were fine in the weeks before his death. Another blow to the idea that he was too confused to make rational decisions. Henry Gardner submitted a sworn statement recalling how Dad had mentioned wanting 50-50 for the boys. Finally, we discovered that the second attorney Dad hired had abruptly shuttered his practice after Dad died, apparently due to personal issues. By chance, Patricia tracked him down. He confirmed that Dad had approached him for a new will, but Dad passed away before the final signature. Josh's footprints were all over this fiasco. The attorney recalled someone from the Parker family collecting the preliminary paperwork, but then never returning. As the court date approached, I started getting messages from extended family members. Some asked me to drop the dispute, claiming I was tearing the family apart. Others said they suspected all along that Dad favored Josh simply out of tradition. He was the firstborn son, after all. More than one relative thanked me for standing up for myself, admitting they'd always felt Josh was manipulative. It was draining to sort through the swirl of opinions. Meanwhile, I couldn't sleep most nights, playing over every possible outcome in my head. If I lost, I'd not only remain disinherited, but I'd also have spent a small fortune on legal fees. Yet there was no going back. Dad's words, scrawled in those margins, spurred me on. Need to correct original distribution. Unfair to Brandon. How could I turn my back on that? When the trial finally commenced, the tension was palpable. Josh sat on one side of the courtroom, flanked by his attorneys, while I sat on the other. Our relatives packed the benches. The judge listened intently as Patricia laid out the sequence of events, the suspicious timing of the official will's signing, the existence of the revised draft, the family friend's testimony, the handwriting analysis, and the second attorney's statement. Josh's team shot back with arguments that the official will was fully legal, properly witnessed, and notarized. They insisted the draft was incomplete, that it was never signed or officially witnessed, so it had no standing. But you could sense the shift in the room when the second attorney testified about how determined Dad was to finalize it, about how Dad had set an appointment he never got to keep because he was hospitalized. On cross-examination, Josh's lawyers tried to discredit him, implying he had no solid proof. But the man remained calm, detailing the exact dates and the content of his meetings with Dad. It was powerful. Then Henry Gardner took the stand, explaining the financial side of things and clarifying that Dad was mentally and physically capable of making decisions right up until the final days. Josh's face grew more and more tense. At one point, I thought he might lash out, but he kept his cool. When it was his turn, he spoke about how Dad always trusted him more, how Dad felt I was too immature to handle business. He painted a picture of me as a resentful younger brother grasping for an inheritance that was never meant for me. I listened, my stomach churning. But then Patricia cross-examined him, bringing up the locked file cabinet, the fact that only he had the means to hide the new draft after Dad died. Josh stumbled a bit, claiming ignorance, which didn't align with how meticulously he'd handled everything else. It felt like the tide was turning. After several tense days, the judge asked for a short recess to review all the evidence and testimony. Everyone was on edge. I remember stepping outside the courthouse, the crisp air filling my lungs. Josh and I crossed paths. He stared at me with a mixture of anger and something else, maybe fear. Then he said in a low voice, "Let's not pretend Dad ever fully trusted you. You think you're winning, but you're just dragging his name through the mud." I wanted to snap back that it was him who was disrespecting Dad's final wishes, but I kept quiet. No point in fueling more drama. When the judge delivered the final ruling, it felt like time slowed. She acknowledged that the official will was properly signed and notarized, so typically it would stand. However, she cited case law that if there was clear and convincing evidence, the testator, Dad, intended to modify or replace that will, a court could issue an order reflecting that intent. She concluded that the draft, combined with the attorney's testimony and supporting statements, met that standard. Therefore, the court ordered that the estate should be divided more equitably, aligning with the draft's provisions. My heart hammered. This meant Josh no longer held everything. We were to inherit equal shares with some specific language about the family business that ensured neither of us could dominate the other without mutual agreement. It wasn't a flawless victory. There were still logistical hurdles, financial complexities, and months of additional paperwork. But in the most important sense, we had won. Dad's real intentions would be honored. Leaving the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off me. Even though the process had been draining and ugly, at least the truth was out. I spotted Josh in the hallway, standing with his lawyers. He looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. His shoulders slumped. Our eyes met, and for a second I saw pure hatred in his glare. Then he turned away and stormed off. I didn't chase after him. I knew the rift between us wouldn't magically heal. We might never be the same. But as I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, I reminded myself that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that not everyone will forgive you for it. Dad deserved to have his final words heard, and that's what mattered. In the weeks and months that followed, the practical side of the ruling took shape. I gained half the assets, which included part ownership of Parker Management. It was surreal. I'd never fully prepared to run any portion of the family business, but I felt a responsibility to do it justice. Josh and I had forced awkward meetings about management decisions. He tried to undercut me a few times, but the new legal framework kept him from acting unilaterally. If nothing else, it forced us both to find some kind of middle ground, even if that middle ground was laced with tension. People at the office whispered about the changes, rumors swirling about how I overthrew my brother. But the truth was simpler. Dad wanted this. Every now and then, I'd open up that file folder labeled Revised Will Draft and read Dad's handwritten notes in the margins, the paragraphs that spelled out his apology for any past favoritism. He'd penned lines about wanting his sons to move forward as equals. It hurt to know he didn't live long enough to finalize those wishes himself. Maybe if he'd gotten those signatures sorted out in time, I could have avoided a legal battle and kept some semblance of a normal relationship with Josh. But life rarely goes that smoothly. One afternoon, while clearing out old boxes in Dad's study, I stumbled on a small envelope I hadn't noticed before. It contained a short letter addressed to both Josh and me, seemingly one of Dad's personal letters he never mailed. It read, "My two boys. I did my best to raise you, though I know my methods weren't always even-handed. I hope you can forgive my failures. I love you both in different ways. I just want you to have the chance to carry on our family legacy together. Don't let pride tear you apart." Reading those words nearly brought me to tears. I tucked the letter away, deciding not to show it to Josh yet. Maybe someday, when tensions cooled, I'd share it with him in hopes we could mend things. In the meantime, I tried to honor Dad by making sensible, ethical decisions at Parker Management. The staff seemed surprised, some even relieved, that I was willing to collaborate rather than bulldoze my way in. Slowly, I gained respect. And ironically, I saw glimpses of how this scenario could have played out if Dad had just told us both explicitly that we'd share the business. Maybe Josh wouldn't have felt threatened, and maybe I wouldn't have felt cheated. Maybe we'd have figured out a healthier balance. But I suppose we'll never know. Even so, in those quieter moments, I found a peace in knowing I had done right by Dad's wishes. I refused to be the passive, forgotten son. Dad might not have been perfect, but in the end, he did attempt to fix the imbalance. It was Josh who tried to bury that. The final words of the judge's ruling ring in my ears sometimes, about how the law aims to carry out the true will of the deceased. Now, that true will was recognized. I felt on some level a sense of closure. And despite the lingering bitterness between Josh and me, I realized I no longer had to wonder if my father loved or believed in me. He did, even if it came too late and caused a family storm. A year later, I sat in the old cabin I'd once thought was worthless, which ironically turned out to be a nice retreat on weekends. The place was run down, sure, but something about its quiet isolation gave me clarity. I walked along the shoreline, remembering how Dad used to mention wanting to spend more time in nature, away from the hustle of city life. I felt him there in the gentle ripple of the water, the scent of pines, the hush of the wind. The anger and grief had started to fade, replaced by a cautious acceptance. Dad did what he could at the end. I'd uncovered the letter, found the draft, battled for the truth, and emerged with not only a share of the estate but also a deeper understanding of who my father was and who my brother and I had become. People sometimes ask me if it was worth the fight. The money and property aside, I believe it was. I fought for Dad's real intentions, for that final spark of fairness he was trying to give me. I fought because I refused to let a lifetime of being overshadowed continue into eternity. If that caused a permanent rift between Josh and me, so be it. I hope one day we can meet on better terms without resentment. Until then, I remind myself that life is complicated, families are messy, and sometimes justice has to be dragged into the light kicking and screaming. So, yeah, that's the story of how I discovered my father's hidden letter and the revised will that changed everything. It was a roller coaster of betrayal, legal drama, emotional fallout, and, ultimately, a bittersweet victory. But I'll always hold on to one simple truth. Dad meant for both of us to carry on. He wanted us to inherit something beyond just money, a sense of unity. And even if that unity is still a long way off, I like to think he'd be proud that I uncovered his final wish and made sure it didn't vanish under someone else's agenda. When I stand on that cabin porch looking at the water, I imagine him there, telling me I did all right, that I made sure his last intentions counted. That's more valuable to me than any check I could cash.